find yourself getting overly defensive when someone gives you criticism or feedback and then lashing out at them in a way that is probably not the most effective? And then afterwards start thinking, oh, I wish I shouldn't have reacted that way. I don't know what got into me. Or do you find yourself being an over perfectionist where everything has to be perfect and you beat yourself up like crazy when you don't get something right because you're looking for approval and you're constantly looking for someone to validate how good you are? Or do you find yourself being overly controlling where you're constantly telling people what to do, taking charge, being authoritative, and have trouble letting go or delegating? Well, some of these things can be caused by unconscious past experiences that have been solidified in your brain. And today we're going to talk about this topic, and we're going to talk about trauma. And trauma is not necessarily what we think of. We don't have to go through what we consider a death or something very, very traumatic in our experiences to internalize trauma and then behave in ways that are probably not conducive to the best type of leadership we want. And so today I'm talking to Kelly Campbell, who wrote a book called Heal to Lead. And once I saw that book, I thought she definitely should be on the show because she talks about what the impact of trauma has on our leadership styles and how learning to integrate that trauma can help us become better leaders. So, Kelly, I'm so delighted to have you on today. One of the things that as soon as I saw the topic of your new book, Heal to Lead, I was just mesmerized because I'm finding in my own work, in executive coaching and leadership development, this exact concept that you talk about. So I was dying to have you on the show to have a conversation with you a little bit about this topic of trauma and how it affects leadership. So with that, before we even get started, I wanted to just get a little bit about how you decided to write a book like Heal to Lead.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the
Yeah.
show. I'm excited to be here. You know, as with most books of this nature, everything is from personal experience, and then there's research, and then there's, experience, expertise in the industry. This really was a very personal story for me because I grew up in a household with a mother who had two different mental health conditions. I didn't know that at the time. And it made me second guess so much about myself and who I was. And I didn't realize that it was also sort of laying the foundation to create who I was going to be as an adult and then eventually as a leader, owning my own businesses. And so it really wasn't until the sale of my cause marketing agency in about 2016 where I started really diving into, why did I even start a company to begin with at 22 years old? What was that about? Um, and what I really started to unravel there was that business in my mind, of course, subconsciously, was really trying to play out an unmet need from childhood. And so what I mean by that is I was trying to feel a sense of worth, a sense of mattering through the vehicle of business ownership. I wanted to matter to my clients and my employees and all of this. And anytime that you outsource self-validation, it's a losing proposition. In figuring that out, it was like, okay, now that I'm aware of that, I can create a very different path going forward. And I had been in therapy since I was about 16, but talking about what was happening in the past wasn't actually helping me to resolve any of it. And so I knew that I needed to go in some different directions for, the remainder of my life.
Wow. So as you talk, I first of all, I'm getting the goosebumps, and second of all, I'm so resonating with your story on two levels. One is similar experiences as you, right? So I have the childhood issues that didn't realize them until I was older. And also I see with so many of my clients, these past wounds start coming up as they
Cool.
talk, right? And it's manifesting in the need for external validation, as you just mentioned, right? And it also manifests in this super high achieving manner. The other thing I noticed, Kelly, is that their identity gets wrapped up in their job because of this. So that's why I find it fascinating. And I'm wondering, as people hear us talk, immediately, what I know just by the nature of some of my clients is that they'll immediately say, oh, wait a minute, now we're going to blame everything on childhood. It's like, I'm past that. I'm overcome that. I don't have trauma, et cetera. What would you say to
So I
that?
hear that all the time.
Yeah.
And, first of all, a lot of people will say, well, I had a great childhood. I didn't experience any trauma. This isn't about blaming mom or dad or whoever our caregivers were. The reality of the situation is that every single one of us experienced trauma. Most people think of it as big T, right? Parents of divorce, parents who have gone through divorce, maybe a parent who was incarcerated, maybe living in a war-torn nation, a parent with an illness or a parent that had died, when younger, or even a sibling. There are so many of these sort of much larger, we call big T trauma experiences. And if we only look at those, then most people can say, nope, I've never had any of those things, right? Because many times those are outliers for a lot of people. But when you start to include small T traumas, feelings of abandonment, rejection, betrayal, humiliation, etc., every single one of us has had those experiences in school, maybe with a teacher, if we were into our, religious organizations, with our friends. And again, we're talking about 0 to about 14. Some people may even say it goes up to about 24, but every single one of us has had those experiences, whether it's at home, at school, or in social groups. So to say that you have not experienced any trauma and that trauma is not following you and has not created a foundation for who you are, why you react the ways that you do, is really short-sighted. And I think that there's a lot of stigma around trauma, which is why no one wants to really associate with it, because a lot of people are going to, again, really attach to these larger T traumas. And the people who even know about smaller T traumas might, be in the camp of, well, that's just life, right? Get on with it, kid.
Right.
We can't negate the idea or the fact, really, that these things really follow us because they are part of our makeup, our composition as we get older. And so when we step into leadership roles, these things don't just evaporate. They don't just dissipate because we've now stepped into adulthood or we're now managing other people. In fact, they are sort of the foundation for how we are going to interact with other people, the reactions that we will have when we are activated based on those smaller, experiences in our past. So we can't get away from it.
So when we're talking about trauma, you and I are having a definition in our head. How would you define trauma? I know you just described two types of trauma,
Mhm.
but talk a
So,
little bit about that.
so, again, there's so much stigma around this word. A lot of people will go to the definition of physical trauma, which is really the root of the word, the etymology of the word, in Greek means wound, right?
Trauma.
We're
Yeah.
not necessarily, if you're talking about big T trauma, physical wounding could be part of it, right? But what we're really talking about is psychological wounding, because that, in many cases, physical wounds can heal. Psychological wounds need a little help to heal. So what trauma is in the definition that I like better than any other definition, and again, this is just my personal experience and opinion, I like the definition of thinking about trauma as energy and information that is unintegrated. And I think what happens when you think about it like that, right? There's a lot less emotion tied to it. If we think about experiences that we've had when we were younger that essentially overrode our nervous system's ability to cope, that's what we mean by trauma. So when we have that definition, you and I could have grown up in the same exact household, had the same experiences, but your nervous system may not have had the ability to cope with a particular situation that mine did, and vice versa. So it's very subjective, it's very individualistic. And I think that's really that nuance and that detail is really important because the people who say, well, I went through something similar to what you're talking about and it didn't impact me. First of all, I would question that. But second of all,
Yeah, I would.
our nervous systems are all different. Our compositions are different, right? So it is very much an individual experience.
So if I have this experience of trauma, how does this impact me as a leader and without even knowing
Much of it is subconscious,
it?
right? Although it's not stored in our memories, it's stored in our bodies,
Mhm.
right? So we know that trauma from the work of Bessel van der Kolk and Gabor Mate and people like that, we know that trauma gets physically trapped in our bodies, energetically, spiritually, emotionally, all of those things. But when I talk about it physically, I mean literally like it's in
Oh,
tissues, it's in our fascia, it's inside of us. So it's not a memory recall, because when there is a traumatic experience, it's the body's memory that's being imprinted. It's not the mind, right? Because we can have different or similar experiences in adulthood that we had in childhood that may not look exactly the same, but there is a resonance to it. There's a similarity and it makes us respond or react in a way that sort of seems um, really not analogous to what the situation is. And so that shows up in leadership many times where we might have some feedback, let's say as a leader, and our egos are nice and nice and inflated in our leadership positions. We don't want to be challenged. Maybe when we were younger, we felt a feeling of powerlessness. And so when we get feedback that's difficult to hear, we might get very defensive. We might blow up. And so that response or that reaction is not really in line with what the feedback is. It's like, um, that's one of so many
oh,
examples,
and it's such a
right?
great example. It's such a great example, Kelly. I
Yeah.
mean, I can't tell you how often I encounter that.
Mm.
Often, we'll give leaders a 360 assessment where they'll get feedback from people. And that feedback will come up is that I can't give this person feedback because they're going to get defensive or blow up. And then they do. And so it's that's a big one. And so how does one start to integrate this trauma?
So, when trauma happens, right? We talked about this before, it's unintegrated energy or information. In order to reincorporate or reintegrate that information so that it's not making us have those really outlandish reactions, we have to start to really get curious. So we look around, we start to notice, and this obviously takes some self-awareness, but it's the noticing of particular patterns or noticing that maybe if you're leading a meeting and you're throwing it out to the team, hey, I'd love ideas about XYZ, and everyone is silent. Well, that's a noticing. Maybe the people in that room aren't being made to feel comfortable that their ideas, that their risks that they might bring up, some of the other things that they're voicing are going to be met with this sort of authoritative stance or defensive, or maybe even, oh, yeah, I hear that idea and that's never going to work, right? So how comfortable will people be if that's kind of your response? Or it might be similar setting where you're in a meeting and you say, okay, we've got to figure out this particular solution to a problem. And you're the one who says first, this is what my idea is. You're not leaving room for anyone else to sort of add to that or question that. And again, that's like, you're wanting to take credit, you're wanting to sort of be the largest or the loudest voice in the room. So these are two small examples of how that can look. People who are not self-aware, it's difficult for them to even see, oh, this and this and this is happening. I wonder if any of that has to do with me. So it's really sort of like a pivotal moment of curiosity. Once that little crack is opened, then we can work with it. But if there's zero self-awareness, if there's zero responsibility taken, really, honestly, sometimes some people have to hit rock bottom or have a very catastrophic experience in order to be sort of woken up.
How do you figure out if it's beyond, it's like damaged. It's for example, if people don't really know if they have some sort of a personality disorder or it has damaged them to the degree where that self-awareness isn't going to come in on its own. Like, for example, borderline personality or narcissism or, those sorts of things. How does one know when they're at that point or that level?
Well, again, this comes back to the curiosity, right? Like what you're talking about is basically just a diagnosis. So
Right.
part of the curiosity is I wonder how much of this is really my responsibility, how much of this should I be taking ownership for, and then let me start to go take the steps to, work on that. That could be seeing a therapist for the first time. That could be engaging a coach for the first time, talking with someone about, hey, I'm noticing these things and I'm wondering, what your assessment would be. Again, they have to be willing to
Yeah.
receive that as well, even as difficult as it might be. And that's where a good coach or a good therapist can also help with that, right? Even in those moments where there is a reaction, it's like, okay, I see that you're having some emotion come up. Could you also leave a little bit of space, even in that emotional state, to wonder and to get curious why this was happening or why this feedback was given. And if, they do decide to go and see a therapist, maybe the therapist might say, I think something more is going on here, might send someone for a personality assessment or something like that. That might lead to a referral to a psychiatrist, and then, you can go from there. But, as coaches, it's not up to us to diagnose any of this. It's literally just and as leaders, trauma-informed leaders, I think that's another myth that I love cracking is as a trauma-informed leader of an organization or on a leadership team, you do not need to, know what people's trauma is. You do not need to act the part of a therapist. You
I
just
was going
need,
to ask you that. That was my next question. People are going to
yeah.
say, I'm not equipped to do this. Yeah. Good.
Yeah, yeah, and nor should you be equipped, but you should be aware, right? And so the training of becoming a trauma-informed leader is really important because then you start to notice things. You start to notice how certain people are acting or reacting, and you have a little bit of a sense of why that might be, but you're not unpacking that with anyone. What you're doing is you're creating a really supportive growth environment. I don't say safe spaces because safety is subjective, but you're
Mhm.
creating a supportive growth environment so that people feel like they can be themselves and bring, their authentic nature to the table. If they also need support, you're leaning in to understand more about what kind of support, how they need to be supported, and then sort of running this filter through your head, which I talk about in the book, which is like, what does this employee need or what does this colleague need? What does the business need? And what do I need as the leader, right? So you're really engaging holistically with the support mechanism for that particular employee. That's really, at the end of the day, what trauma-informed leadership is about. It's about a lot more than that. But if we're going to boil it down, it's not about you sitting in a therapist chair and diagnosing your employees. That is such a myth. A lot of people say, there's no way, I don't feel comfortable doing that. I feel
It's not a
so out of
psychologist,
depth.
right? That's
Yeah, you don't need to be. You don't need to be.
do you have any other ideas or any other thoughts, either from your book or just from your research, about how one can start to look inward and look at some of these things by themselves?
I mean, that really, it does boil down to the curiosity. If you are a naturally curious person versus someone with a very fixed kind of mindset, that it's going to be a lot easier, to lean into that. I think maybe starting with the question, which again is very difficult, but maybe it's a post-it note on your computer or your wall. Where is there potentially a place where I can take responsibility for this? Or where could I own my portion of what's happening, right? How might I have contributed to if there's conflict or something like that, as an example? That actually has a lot of roots in indigenous conflict resolution. In indigenous cultures, a lot of, the way that conflict is resolved is through this idea of really bringing responsibility and ownership to the table as the start of the conversation, not sharing impact. You did this, I did that, not even the I feel language of therapy, right? It's like literally coming to the table with what part of this can I own?
Yeah, I love that. There's a lot of wisdom in that and what you just
Yeah.
mentioned. One of the things I know you mentioned and you talk about, which I think is really relevant to this audience, is you talk about the manifestation of trauma, right, in leadership. And you talk a little bit about the over people pleasing or controlling. Can you say a little more, more about that for this audience? Because obviously they haven't read the book, and this is so important, I think, in workplaces.
Yeah, I mean, in researching for the book, there are so many places and so many legs that, we really, I could have brought in to help explain how this manifests in leadership. There's attachment theory, there's, fight or flight. There's so many things that I do touch upon in the book, but really, I think I wanted to boil it down to something that was really easy for everyone to understand without any clinical or research background. I wanted it to be really digestible and approachable. And so boiling this down into two different trauma-based styles, people-pleasing leaders and people-controlling leaders. And the easiest way to think about this, and again, before I even say anything about it, I want to say it's not an either or.
Mhm.
It's not I identify as a people pleaser or I identify as a people controller. You can be both on the same day. I was both on the same day many days when I was running my organization. It's a spectrum, right? And so we flow kind of in between, especially given the fact that, trauma doesn't just look one way for one person and it doesn't just impact us in one way. It can be disorganized. It can be a little chaotic. It can manifest in all of these different ways. So on the people pleasing end of the spectrum, we have people who just wanted to get it right, wanted to earn the love and attention and belonging of their caregivers. So these people would, and I'm one of them, I would do anything. I would try to get straight A's and accomplish that even to the detriment of my own health. Perfect attendance in school, captain of every sports team, honor roll, AP classes, right? So in school and athletics, it looked like that. These become our high performance clients. Now, that essentially, what worked for us or what we thought might work for us in childhood was we were trying to get that love and attention and belonging from our caregivers. And for some of us, it might have worked, and some of us, it didn't work. But we still did it nonetheless because it was the only strategy that we could come up with at the time. And it's actually kind of a beautiful design. We don't know if it's going to work or not, but essentially that lays that footprint or that foundation that I've talked about for how then we continue on in life in lots and lots of relationships. On the other end of the spectrum is the people controlling. So I talked before about a powerlessness, right? A feeling of um, I'm never going to be good enough, right? And so instead of people pleasing, I start controlling or trying to control my environment, which we know is an illusion, right? Control is an illusion in general, but we try to control our environment, which in leadership means that we're trying to control the people inside of our environment. That can look like a very authoritative sort of leadership style where we're taking credit for other people's work. We're not letting certain people be promoted because they're challenging, our status in the organization. We're so focused on our own legacy that that's actually more important to us from an egoic standpoint than the organization or other people within it. So again, not an either or, but a spectrum. And I think getting really vulnerable and really curious and really honest about how we show up and how we notice ourselves show up on these parts of the spectrum is really important.
So if I'm aware of this, right? So if I'm aware of these things that you just mentioned, what can I do other than be curious about it in order to?
So I actually overwrote this book by 12,000 words. And the reason why was because I had lots and lots to answer this question in particular, I was getting the same question as a coach. What do I do next?
Mhm.
Right? Where do
I know
I
I'm
start?
like this, right? So I'm aware. Now what? That's what the question will be.
Right. So, because I overwrote the book by so many words, my developmental editor essentially said, "This is great content. I think you should take it out and make it an online resource." So, that resource became what is now myhealingmenu.com. And I created it almost like a restaurant menu. So, appetizers, sharing plates,
Oh,
entrees, and desserts, just to again make it more approachable. And these things are categorized in that way because the appetizers are sort of like that lighter fare, the things that are going to be more cerebral in this case, podcasts and books and things like that to start to learn about yourself and some of the things that you're discovering. Lots of other resources in that section as well. But then we get into the shared plates, which is more when you need someone else from a supportive practitioner standpoint. Um, Shared plates is doing the work with someone else. Then we get into the entrees, which is really some of the more deeper somatic work, somatic meaning moving, right? Movement of moving trauma physically out of the body and out of all of our bodies that we have. A energetic body, spiritual body, auric body, all of these different pieces, right? We're not just a physical body. I think that may be new information to different people, but there are about 6 or 7 layers of us outside of just our physical body. Somatically moving these things and releasing them from where they're being stored and where they're holding us back and holding tension. That's really what the somatic, the entrees are all about. And then I would be remiss if I didn't talk about what I called or categorized as desserts, which were our plant medicines and our psychedelics, because there's so much research now and so many different psychedelics, both synthetic and natural, coming online as trauma healing modalities. I talk about my experience with ayahuasca in the book. And while I would never recommend anyone, go from 0 to 100, I purposefully engaged with that plant medicine after doing years and years and years of all of the other work. So it's not a quick fix. It's definitely not a magic bullet. And I definitely would never recommend going and not doing any psychedelic at all in your life and then going into that. The other, consideration with that is really, psychedelics and plant medicine is not for everyone. If you have a pre-existing mental health condition or you're on medications such as SSRIs, that is going to be contraindicated for you at this point. More research is coming out about that. I was just at a international trauma conference last week, and getting a little bit more about the cutting edge of all of it. There's so much that we can do. And again, that's a non-exhaustive resource, but at least it's got maybe 100 different things where you can start to do your own research, see what you feel called to. What feels interesting to you, what feels like you have capacity to engage with, and what feels like maybe in a couple years.
that's wonderful. I'm glad we'll link that in the show notes for everybody so that they can have access to that and also to the book as well.
Yeah, thank you.
If I'm a listener right now and I'm saying to myself, okay, this is a little bit over the top for me. It's a little too deep. We just need to get results, and I don't have time for all of this. And I'm doing great. I'm high performing. I've got a high performing team. I'm getting the results I need. And okay, well, a few people leave because I'm not exercising the best leadership that I could be.
Mhm.
But oh well, we're not there to babysit. We're there to get results,
Mhm.
make money.
Mhm.
What would you say to that?
I mean, this is really a question about ROI, right? And so my question back to the ROI question is always, you know, what is the cost actually of not stepping in and doing this? Because probably somewhere in the back of your mind, you actually know that what you're doing right now is not sustainable. It might be working in the short term, right? Elon Musk is a great example of that.
Mhm.
It works in the short term, but it's not going to be sustainable. And so the ROI is, if you want sustainability, this is actually where you need to go next. I actually think of trauma integration as the new competitive advantage because there are so many people, the majority of people, not leaning into this stuff. And it's the people who are leaning in that they're the ones who are going to be on that new frontier, and they are going to have that really that sustainability long term. People want to work for people who are healing, actively healing leaders because they model a different way. They're very comfortable with vulnerability. They lead with compassion and they light the way for other people, right? You and I have, I'm sure, both had bosses in the past who have probably leaned in the way that you're talking about in this example, and we didn't stay,
Right.
right? And many people who know their worth are not going to stay and work for people who, hurt people. If the ideology is this is about business, this is not personal, we're not doing healing stuff here. This is all kind of
But yeah, that's what it, oh,
kumbaya, woo woo. I've heard it all.
yeah.
And for the last decade, I think people got away with that rhetoric. After the pandemic, there's no way.
Yeah.
There's no way because we're not able to not bring mental health into the conversation, thankfully, anymore. Right?
I couldn't agree with you more. I couldn't
Yeah.
agree with you
I
more.
mean, we're talking about people who are choosing to invest their time working for your organization. Do you want to support them and their mental health and everything that comes along with their investment in you so that you can ultimately get to that return on investment and make money? I think what you're also really asking is the people who are still of the mindset that business, because we're talking about business here, probably not nonprofits
Yeah.
necessarily,
Yeah.
but people who are of the mindset that the purpose of business is purely and solely to make money, that is also a mindset that really needs to be reframed because it's so much more than that. That is a byproduct, and that is one of the things that will happen and should happen for sustainability, but it is not the sole reason for the business. You have, as a leader, you have way too much power and impact, and opportunity to really change the lives of the people who you're working with, to mentor them, to promote them, to help them grow as individuals. Yes, professionals, but as individuals, as humans more than anything. So what are you going to do with that opportunity? Are you going to throw it out the window just to like make a couple bucks? It's just not sustainable.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. And I love the example you gave there. It's a really good one. I think what's happening as well is the complexity of the world is expanding, right? And so does our consciousness need to expand. And so I think there's a
Yeah.
piece of that as well. And it can't expand without doing this work for
Yeah,
sure.
absolutely. So the work that I do, I say it's at the intersection of trauma, leadership, and consciousness, which is the new TLC.
I love it. I love it because I mean, I am so in alignment with what you're saying here, Kelly. I see it every day. I see it in myself, right? As a person who's trying to continuously evolve. And
Mhm.
I think what we really are talking about is evolving
Yeah.
as human beings and as leaders.
Yeah, I like that you use that word because it really goes back to that example, right? It's that fixed mindset is there's no more evolution. You're essentially saying, I know everything I need to know.
Right.
I don't have time for growth,
Right.
personal growth.
Right.
I don't have time for evolution. I just want to make my money, get in, get out. And okay, I mean, being a compassionate leader, um, I don't want to judge that.
Right.
It's not the way that I would do it or actually do it. I can't judge that, but certainly don't take up a leadership role with that mindset if there is another leader who will do it better.
One more question that I just to kind of set the end of this discussion is, do you have an inspirational quote or a motto or any other words of wisdom that you would offer this audience just to kind of
Mm.
compartmentalize our conversation?
I think that there are two, if you'll allow me to give you two.
Absolutely.
Um, I love Rumi as a poet. And so one of Rumi's quotes that I absolutely love is I'm paraphrasing, but don't give from the depths of your well, give from your overflow. And this is really about taking care of you, really, heal to lead, right? The more that you are full and really well, you can give from what you have left.
That's the essence of presence in
Yeah.
my, really,
Yeah.
is how you're bringing yourself forward in that
Yeah.
way. So
You
anyway,
cannot be present if you're
yeah.
not giving from your overflow. And then one of the quotes that I did a collaboration with a climate artist, one of the quotes that she pulled from the book, which we put on t-shirts, which was really fun, was, what if we do it all for the purpose of healing ourselves, each other, and the earth? What if that's the whole thing? What if that's why we're here? I like to think that is maybe the reason.
I love that. I love
Yeah.
it. As you quoted Rumi, what comes to my mind is, I'm paraphrasing, right? The wound is where the light comes in.
Oh, that's actually the epigraph for chapter 1.
So, right? I mean,
Yeah,
that's really, if
yeah,
when you really think about it, you're talking about wounded healers on some level, right? And
that is
so
absolutely it.
healing the
Healing
wound,
the wound.
and
Yeah. Actually, I have the exact one because it's been sort of in the zeitgeist for so long, but the actual quote
uh-huh.
is, keep looking at the bandaged place. That is where the light enters you.
Um,
That's the original translation.
there you go.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
bandaged place, the wound.
that's the wound. And so
Yeah,
that's where the biggest epiphany can come, right? And the biggest.
absolutely.
Thank you so much, my wise woman. I really appreciate your wisdom today, and just your whole, everything that you shared with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Janet. This was really fun.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm really looking forward to hearing the episode.